Today is Friday, 11th of February 2022, and we're witnessing renewed protests, anti-government protests in Syria. And I want to address these protests from the domestic and from the external perspectives or from angles. And I will tell you why these protests are happening now in Syria. First of all, the protest is concentrated mostly in the southern governorate of al-Suwaida. There are around 500,000 people living there. Mostly are from the Syrian Druze community. And the reasons or the declared reasons for that are multiple. For example, they are referring to the government corruption. And if anyone denies that corruption is skyrocketing in Syria, is detached from the reality. This is true. There is a big fuel crisis in Syria. The government is unable to secure fuel to the people. But is the government responsible for that? Partially, not completely, because you have to know 50% of Syria's oil and gas fields are occupied by the United States, and there is a big blockade on Syria, and Damascus is unable to secure the fuel. There are some coming from Iran, but that's not enough. Electricity. Is the government, there is a big shortage of electricity in Syria. Is the government solely responsible? No, it's partially responsible. Because also the infrastructure of Syria is more or less destroyed. And the United States, for example, and the militants that they supported have destroyed a lot of power plants in Syria. However, if we check the status of the electricity, let's say in 2014 and 15, when the battles were raging between the Syrian army and ISIS, between the Syrian army and al-Nusra or al-Qaeda, the electricity status was better back then. So the people are asking a question. Why 5-6 years ago, when the war was raging, we had more electricity than we have now? The government is not able to provide answers. That's the real problem. In my opinion, the Syrian government is very weak in communication. They're unable to communicate efficiently with the Syrian people. They're not able to deliver their messages. They're not able to connect with the Syrian people and tell them what has gone wrong. That's, for me, more problematic than the problem itself, because if an official comes, let's say he appears on TV and he tells the people, we have 1, 2, 3 problems and we are solving them, and then we put a time frame, and in this time frame we will solve it. That's not happening. So the people are asking, why shall I live for, like, I'm receiving, let's say 4 or 5 or 6 hours maximum of electricity per day. I will give you an example. In Aleppo, for example, there is maybe 6 hours of electricity per day, but there are warlords and mafias in Aleppo, and they are able to secure electricity through generators, and they're selling this electricity to the people by monthly fees. So the question is, if Syria doesn't have fuel, then how these people are securing the fuel to sell them later to the Syrian people in terms of electricity, right? So these are legitimate questions, and the government is unable to provide answers. The government is imposing taxes based on ridiculous reasons. For example, they are increasing taxes on the mobiles. And if you want to buy, let's say, a mobile here in Germany, it's cheaper than in Syria. Why is that? Why should the Syrian people pay big taxes on mobiles and other also goods, on cars and etc.? Like, cars here in Germany are cheaper than in Syria. It's crazy, right? The government of Syria since the 60s and the 70s, because it was a socialist government, they used to support certain basic needs or the necessities. For example, bread, fuel. So if the fuel, let's say, costs $1, the government supports 50%, so pays 50 cents, and the people pay 50 cents. That was how things used to work. And now the government said, I'm no more able to support the people. I will withdraw my support. from the basic necessities to the people who do not need this support. So I will only support the poor. But how are they really calculating if you're poor or not? For example, they say if you have a car that is a 2008 car and above, then you're not poor. 2008 car, man. It's already very old. And the people are really raging. So in 2011, when the protests started, I always said there are no preconditions for a revolution. The people were living in very good economic situation, and there was no need for a revolution. But after 2018, and of course now I'm saying the other side of the story, which is I say the government is partially responsible for this situation and there are protests. So this is the domestic factor, and then comes the foreign factor and the external factor. That is the economic warfare against Syria and the siege and the sanctions and the Caesar Act. You cannot deny that these sanctions are having it's a very extreme situation that these sanctions are putting the Syrian people under harsh conditions. It's undisputable, and I have made videos about them. You can watch them on Syriana analysis about the Caesar Act and the sanctions of the United States and the European Union. So this is the external factor that the outside powers aren't helping Syria to recover. Now, why the protests now? It's been like this, the situation in the past 2-3 years. Of course, as I mentioned, there is the domestic factor, but on an external level, let's remember this was 2 weeks ago. Biden designated Qatar as a major non-NATO ally for the US, okay? And we all know that Qatar has very good relations with the Democrats in the United States. And it seems that the United States is once again telling Qatar that you should play a bigger role in the region. So in the past, when Biden came to power, he said, Syria is not a priority for me. It's already it become a weak state, so I'm not going to take so much effort on it. And the UAE jumped into the wagon and they said, okay, then we open the relations back with Syria and we try to make a reconciliation between Syria and the other Arab countries. So there was some efforts. But the Qataris, the Turks, and the Israelis weren't happy with the efforts of the Emiratis to push forward the reconciliation process between Syria and the Arab countries. So the AIPAC and Qatari lobbies were pushing very hard in the United States, in the American administration, to continue the sanction regime and to impose more sanctions and to not give up on the Syrian fight. And it seems they succeeded somehow. And now with this designation of Qatar as a major non-NATO ally, Qatar is playing, again, a specific role. And just a few days after this designation, Qatar called all its collaborators, those who call themselves the Syrian opposition, and they gathered in Doha, of course, the paradise of democracy, right? Doha is the paradise of democracy. So all these collaborators went there and they decided to escalate in Syria. And they started to call for protests again, and especially in the governorate of as-Suwaida. Why in Suwaida? Because Suwaida is divided between pro and anti-government people. It's vulnerable, the security situation there. There are still militias who do not belong to the Syrian government. There is a very influential Druze leader. His name is Walid Jumblat, and he's Lebanese, but he has a regional influence over the Druze. He's very anti-Assad, and he is urging his people to protest. You have a figure called Faisal Qasem. He's a very famous and influential anchor or a journalist, works for Al Jazeera. He has millions of followers. He's urging the people to protest, and he's from as-Suwaida. He's a Druze himself. And also Israel has an influence in as-Suwaida through the people of Jumblat and Faisal Qasem. So what does Israel want from Suwaida? If we go back a little bit in 2014 and 2015, when ISIS and al-Nusra attacked as-Suwaida and they were murdering the Druze there, Israel jumped the wagon and they said, hold on, I'm going to help the Druze community there. I'm going to create a buffer zone and accept or host the Druze in order to protect them, right? So they wanted to create a buffer zone. Now, some people argue and say, but the Suwaida, between Suwaida and the Golan Heights, there is Dara. But if Suwaida goes out of control again and the government loses its grip over Suwaida entirely, I think it may have a domino effect on Dara as well, although it's very difficult to bring back Dara into this conflict because the Syrian army is there, the Russian army is there, I think even the Iranians and Hezbollah have forces there. It's very difficult, but it is on the table. Israel revived this goal or dream again to create some sort of a buffer zone that separates Damascus from the Syrian occupied Golan. So is it possible? It's very difficult, but it's on the table. Now, let's remember the Russian foreign intelligence just a week ago, they stated that the United States is working to ignite new protests in Syria, and they even mentioned that they're planning for attacks against the Syrian army, the Russian army, and the Iranian army in Syria. So I would say we have to take this note or statement seriously because the Russians, of course, they know what's going on in Syria and they have intelligence information. And if now attacks happen against the Syrian army and the Syrian army retaliates, there will be bloodshed. And in the Syrian culture or in the Middle Eastern culture, you know, if there is a blood, that means there will be revenge. So if one person dies, that will lead into 1,000, 2,000, and 3,000 deaths. And the snowball of blood will hit Syrians again. And that's very dangerous. Syria could lose everything now if again infighting happens in Syria, whether through external hands or not. So the government of Syria has to close all the windows that the enemies of Syria are jumping from into the domestic scene. And what I mean by that, the Syrian government has to fight corruption seriously and efficiently. Period. They have to find alternative ways to generate electricity and energy. There are alternative ways, from the windmills, from the solar panels, and even solar panels on the water, or from the sea wave power. There are alternative ways. It's not possible that we have to wait for the foreign powers to agree on a compromise so that we can restore our Syrian gas and energy fields. They have to find solutions, alternative ways from now. If not, then if they don't want to find alternative ways, then let them liberate eastern shores of the Euphrates. If that's the only way for you to secure your energy resources. If you don't want to liberate the eastern shores of the Euphrates now, it's not the right time, then you have to find alternative ways to generate electricity. There is no other way. Stop imposing taxation on the Syrian people. I don't understand how can you impose taxation on the Syrian people when the salaries are $50, $60, maybe maximum $100 per month. It's crazy. As if the government is like the losses that they suffered is enormous. I understand, but you cannot feel your bank or your balance from the Syrian people. They're also suffering. They can't. That's not possible. And if you want to remove the support from the basic necessities, like it used to be under a socialist economy, at least do not touch the bread. Do not stop supporting the bread. That's the government's responsibility. The people are suffering, the people are starving, and there are sanctions, and you know there is corruption, and you cannot, in such circumstances, take away your support from the bread. Period. So today, There were protests in al-Suwaida. I just hope that it ends well with no bloodshed. I'm not really optimistic, but I hope I am wrong. I've been your host, Kevork Almassian of Syriana Analysis. If you're new, please consider subscribing and hit the like button. It really helps me with the algorithm of YouTube. And if you want to support my independent political commentary work, you can become a patron. Link in the description below. And see you next time.